fidèle Michael Cronin. Voilà, très bonne soirée à tous et merci à tous d'être venus, en particulier à ceux qui viennent de loin. Je sais que tout le monde ne vient pas de Dublin ce soir et merci d'avoir fait le déplacement. Très bonne soirée.
Can I sit down? Yes, sure. I'll sit down. Anthony Barrow, Linguistic Press. Welcome, one and all. Distinguished visitors and others.
And the microphone.
And the microphone.
Yeah.
Maylis Besserie is the reverse of Samuel Beckett, an ardent French hibernophile. So it's a privilege to welcome her to her country of adoption for the publication of her first book in English, Yell Sam, You Still Can. A friend of mine, who's one of our more discerning readers of the book, was recently stricken by COVID and confined to bed, like the subject of Maylis's book. And he had this to say. This is an email that came in yesterday. I read Maylis Besserie's book in my sickbed. Read it in short bursts between sleep and mind blanking malaise. It went very well with the aches and shivers and slid perfectly into a starring role in my fractured, febrile dreams. An audacious thing to try for a first novel. I think it succeeded quite brilliantly in channeling the voice and capturing the humorously doomed gentleness of the character. It's quite wonderful. It sent me back to the late condensed prose works too. A telling insight into this wonderful book. Our guest speaker is Professor Michael Cronin, Chair of French from Trinity College Dublin, and one of our finest interlocutors in the field of translation study. A distressingly young author of copious books and studies. His works are available in Arabic, Polish, American, Japanese. A prodigy, Michael.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for a very, very kind introduction. I think the only thing that distresses me is that somebody may give you the wrong date of birth, because I'm not quite the spring chicken. You might think I've been around the city for far too long. But it is, of course, my great pleasure and honour to be here tonight and to, if you like, engage in a conversation with Maylis Besserie, the author of the book that we'll be discussing this evening. Just a word or two about Maylis. Was born in Bordeaux, a novelist and a radio producer for many years with France Culture. Her novel Le Tiers Temps, this is called in French, won the Prix Goncourt du Premier Roman in 2020. And her most recent book, and again, sort of continue on with the French theme, because we have the an encounter between Morgan and Yeats, but it's a kind of it's a post-mortal encounter of a particular kind, and the question is asked: did the body that was sent back to Ireland was it really the relics of Yeats or somebody else? So there's a kind of very interesting continuation of one or two of the themes we're talking about this evening. As part of our the event tonight, we'll towards the end of our conversation we ask Clíona Ní Ríordáin, who is Professor of English at the Sorbonne University, Paris 3, Sorbonne Nouvelle, who is a very distinguished and able translator in both directions. It's quite remarkable. You don't get this too often in translation, where people can translate in both directions. So she's translated a considerable amount of contemporary English language and Irish language poetry into French. And this evening she will be reading from her translation of Maylis's book. I have to say that one of the most vivid memories for me that's associated with the death of Samuel Beckett is an incident that he himself would appreciate. At the time, there was a free advertising newspaper called the Southside Express, and it used to be stories about local events on the south side of the city, and it was everything from kind of dog grooming services to what the council was up to. But on the day after Beckett's death, they had this banner headline: "Famous Fox Rock writer dies in Paris." So obviously this was the most important aspect of Beckett's life. He hailed from Fox Rock. Of course, Fox Rock kind of smuggles its way into Maylis's book. So I suppose the first question really that I wanted to ask you is, what drew you to this project? I mean, what drew you to the idea of, if you like, imaginatively reconstructing the final months of Beckett's life?
First, thank you I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to the Alliance Française of Dublin, and thank you to Michael Cronin that I met a few years ago. He was reading on the beach of Sandy Cove for a broadcast we did on the city and its artists. What can I say about the project? I think oldness was as much as a subject as Beckett, and Beckett was to me the best person who'd be able to describe this kind of poetical state of oldness, being in that atmosphere and losing a bit his memory and being very much the same person at the same time, and having daydreams and being in that very oversensitive state, and getting very, very vivid at some points and having memories of everything, and at the same time getting lost. And I kind of like this state that could lead to dreams and nightmares, and to be a very specific watchers of what's around him. And when I found out that he spent his last months in this nursing home, I couldn't believe that Beckett could have been in such a Beckettian situation. I mean, it was, I find it hilarious, it's very bad of me to say that, but that's true. There was this strangeness of ending in a way that suits him, and I just started to imagine the kind of way he was talking to himself. We all know the way Beckett was writing in both languages. We don't know the way he was talking to himself, and I just imagined his voice and imagined the way he could distance himself of that difficult and very universal and common situation, and how he could find a way to write in his head, even if his head was shaking, so he couldn't really write, but he could find a way to tell himself stories about what was around him.
I mean, what's your sense in which, because one of the things is, imagining Beckett towards the end of his life, that it becomes an opportunity maybe to identify those key relationships in his life, and the relationships that you mentioned in particular are the relationship to his mother, to May, and also the relationship to his partner Suzanne, but particularly the mother. Did it interest you to kind of try and imagine, to explore what this is a man who leaves his langue maternelle to go to another language? He creates this other kind of langue maternelle for himself. So did that interest you as something to explore?
I like this idea that time doesn't really exist, and that probably in your old days memories seem more alive than short memory, and this idea of May being such a ghost and such a passionate relationship. I mean, when you read Beckett's letters, it was such a strong relationship and very disturbing in many ways. So disturbing that he had to run away from this, and he had been in a psychoanalysis with Bayern in London, and he had pretty hard time in his youth, and so he really had to explore that in a very creative way, and I like this idea that there was a kind of mixing between all the women of his life. They're all ghosts, and sometimes it's confused between all of them, you know. And Suzanne has been such an important figure and such an important person in his life, and he met her after he had been attacked. You know, he has this knife attack in the streets of Paris when he was a young man, for almost no reasons. I mean, you know, he got into an argument with some guy in the streets, and he got hurt, and terribly hurt, and it was a very special time for him because his mother came to see him in the hospital, whereas he had been quite distancing himself from her for a long time. And James Joyce came back to him at this time after this Lucia story and all the trouble they got together. And so it was a very special time where he could reconnect to this part of his life. And when his mother, after the war, you know, he hadn't seen his mother during the war. It was good 5 years, 6 years without seeing May. And when he went back to Ireland after the war, having such a strange time, you know, he's been in the resistance, in the French resistance, he hid himself in Roussillon, and with the great painter Haydn, and during this time, you know, his mother got very sick, and he barely recognized her when he saw her, and there's these beautiful letters he wrote about the blue eyes of my mother's blue eyes. I've seen her, you know, I couldn't see any more blue eyes in my life after that, you know. I've seen too much in those eyes, and you can still feel the huge impression it had on him, the huge effect of that relationship. You know, the way he's talking about his mother is like you see the whole humanity in his mother's eyes, and it's very disturbing in a way, and poetical in the same way, because it seems that after the war, after he accepted to be disturbed in many ways and troubled, he understood that he could write with that. You know, he could use it as a material in his writing. You know.
We talked about this question of influence. You described a kind of relationship between May and her son. What about your writing? Like here you are writing about Beckett, and there are many scenes where you're trying to get inside the mind of Beckett. Did you feel yourself as and you know, in the writing you can feel the kind of ruminative, obsessive quality of some of Beckett's prose, but were you afraid at any point of being kind of cannibalized by your subject? That you know, that you had to kind of create a style that was your own and distinct from Beckett's, while at the same time trying to get inside the head of Beckett?
Actually, I had fun doing it. I mean, that's the first thing I have to say, because I really had fun thinking, oh my God, what was he thinking? And you know, as a French person, we have so much vampire Beckett, and Beckett is French to us, and this, you know, he wrote in French, and it was so important in France, the way he wrote in the Édition Minuit, that you know, a lot of writers try to imitate him, and it was a big thing, you know, the way he changed French. But my point of view was, nobody knows, the way he was talking to himself. So I had this kind of creative lack, you know, nobody knows. So I can do whatever I want, and I can try to be a little violin in a huge orchestra, and try just to have a small Beckettian voice, which would be part of his word, but would be mine. And I never thought about. I just had this double music in my head. You know, it's in a French point of view. Beckett is seen as in a very specific way, which I think is not completely true, because the Irishness is missing. You know, I know how important Ireland is in work. I mean, the Irish writers and the Irish humor, Dublin humor, and all that is very important in Beckett's work. And in the Irish point of view, there is always this Frenchness that Beckett has within this. His love for Proust, for example, he's so important. I mean, Proust is everywhere in his work. The very beginning of, you know, the light, to turn off the light, and the man is sick, and he doesn't know if it's the light of the morning or, you know, the evening light, so he'll have to wait the whole night before the light goes back again. So all this part of Proust's work is everywhere in Steering Still, his last book. He has rewritten and paid tribute to Proust in many, many sentences, in many situations, in a very discreet ways. And so he's always traveling between the two languages, the two cultures, the references, and I just thought that I could have maybe access to a bit of this Irishness. I'm not Irish and I don't pretend to, but I have this great love for Ireland, and it's a country I know since I'm 12, 13 years old, and I thought that, yeah, it would be nice to have both sides maybe somewhere in the book.
I remember one time talking to the poet John Montague, who was a good friend of Beckett's in Paris, but Montague said, the problem with Beckett is that he could be quite taciturn and wouldn't say much, but after a few glasses of Jameson, you couldn't shut him up. You just keep talking and talking, and in fact, it's one of the things I think you talk about, where you say at one point, and it's being kind of pushed back into the picture, you say, so this is the Beckett character in the book saying, I drink to forget who I am. It's an Irish solution if truth be told, right? So you can see that's kind of the stock stereotype of the drunken Irishman. But is your work? I mean, that it's not so much about this particular book, not so much about forgetting, it's about remembering, but remembering the complexities and the vulnerabilities of a person, going beyond the kind of the stereotypical representation of a person or a group of people, or whatever. It's bringing dimensions to Beckett that sometimes get forgotten. When Beckett, very often in the French context, would be presented as an extremely cerebral, very intellectual writer, is bringing emotion back into the picture.
Well, it's very mysterious because he hasn't done, a lot of interviews, so nobody knows the person. I mean, we all know the work, and we don't know much about the man except the wonderful James Nelson's biography. But we don't know much about the man except what we wrote, even in the letters and all that. We don't have much of his voice. We don't have much interviews. So there's something mysterious about the man, and it's funny because. What I thought is it's much more. I don't know how can I say that, but the way he traveled between the two languages, there's a lot of humor and sometimes bad humor between them, and I really like that he could be so able to go to tiny details to very metaphysical questions, and it's the same with the language. I mean, he could have terrible details about in Molloy and all that, how many farts a day and how many, it can be like that, and can go to very metaphysical questions. And I really like the fact that you could have the whole word in his work, and in his language. And this is so big, that you can have all the details. And the nursing home is a very, very strange place, and it's a very odd word. And when I went to visit, it's a very different place than it was at the time, but people I met said, yeah, he was very happy here, and he had his, he didn't mix much, he didn't want to have his meals with people and all that, but he kind of watched through the window and what was happening in the yard, and he was, even in the letters, it seemed that he was quite not happy, but he found a way to be okay there, and the way he found is from this very rich word he had inside himself, being a writer, being an artist, he had so much inside him that he could bring back, all the memories of what happened to him, but what he read, what he saw, all the paintings, the music, and he could have this alive anytime. And this was maybe the best way to survive in this loneliness of the end of his days. And the fact that he was kind of, joking, like, I'm an old crock now, like I'm in the situation I described all my life. And I thought that he could be, so wise in the way that he could laugh about that and quite enjoy that, like, oh, I can watch myself being one of my own characters. And I find it quite enjoyable, that you can maybe talk about oldness in a way which wasn't sad, wasn't completely hopeless, but could be very creative,
And did you get the impression that in that way you were doing something? We often think of the kind of classic notion of the novel, of the kind of the Bildungsroman, which is kind of the person at a young age, and then they go out into the world and various things happen to them, and eventually there's kind of a flowering of the person as they discover their true self. But what you're doing is it's not a portrait of the artist as a young man, it's the portrait of the artist as the resident of a retirement home, and that it's a kind of the suggestion that the Bildungs just goes on endlessly. It's not just a particular period in life. Do you think, or Edward Said talks about the late styles. We often think of writers, they do things, they develop, and then there's a point of maturity, and all the rest is kind of decline. And he talks about the late Beethoven, just this explosion of creativity and inquiring spirit. So was that for you the kind of you were going to do the kind of the anti-Bildungsroman some way?
Yeah, I kind of enjoy this idea of a joyful decay. Why not?
I like to hear that. It's reassuring.
Yeah, why not? I mean, if you change your perspective, I mean, the physio comes, the word comes to him, that's the very weird thing in a nursing home, he's inside his bedroom and the word comes to him, the physio comes and the nurse comes and people get him dinner and all that. And everything they say is very formal, it's the institution talking, and I had this idea, not I, on the very specific laws written in Molloy, you have to cycle 2 centimeters from the pavement. He loves this very formal language. So you have all the rules he can read, and it's language. And language is everywhere, in all the signs, in all the formal papers he sees, in all the description of the doctors. And so he becomes his own creature. Okay, now I'm there, dug in the sand, and this is the old Sam falling, and this is the old Sam moving, and but he's still the same man, and this is very moving in a way because he would always be Beckett, and even when he can't talk, when he ends in a coma, he's the same writer, having this creative mind, telling himself sorry, rewriting Joyce's Molloy soliloquy in the last days, and I find it quite moving that there's something that could be the same all lifelong, no matter what memory does to you, no matter what oldness do, something very moving that it kept you the same human being. And I really like this idea, and I find it was a subject in itself, and that Beckett would be the character to tell that story,
You talked about this question of language, and you mentioned earlier, Maylis, the fact that he's moving between English and French, and makes this decision to write in French, and the kind of period when he self-translates into English. And at one point in the book, you have saying, translating myself, incurable linguistic schizophrenia. So there's almost this kind of translated figure, or figure in translation, somebody's doing it. I mean, did you have the impression that you yourself became a kind of translator, that you were translating aspects or dimensions of Beckett's life into the French language, a language that he chose to write in? Were you aware of this kind of, the coexist, the pressure, the tension between these two languages that structured Beckett's existence?
Well, I don't think I did anything to him. I don't think he needed me in any ways, but I think it was easier for me to have less inhibition in a foreign word, I like this Irishness and this different language. He had it in mind, and I thought that the older he got and the more English came back to his mind, and English expression that he uses in French, and he's having fun mixing the two, and telling to the nurse, oh, in English would say that, and translating his own expressions, and having still a huge journey inside the two languages, whereas his legs can't help him, go outside. And so it was less, I had less inhibition thinking of English language and trying to write far from my subject, far from my language, and using the French in a foreign way, which was creative for me, because I thought it's the same problem for everybody. I mean, so many have been written before you, and beautifully written. And in French, we have this problem that the 19th century is the great time of the novel, and we can't write like this anymore. It would be really strange. And at the same time, the language seems to be so poor now, and we can't, use this language of the past. So what can we do with that, And Beckett, being from another language, found his way changing the language and using the French in a very specific way that I can't tell in English. It's a lot of grammar and all that, but the way he used it was very creative because he had this older language in his mind. And I thought that if I could just think of English and French, and that it would help me find my own voice, would be different to what I read as a French reader, and I find it very inspiring.
So in a way, your French prose is ghosted by the presence of this other language, kind of a haunting of some kind.
Yeah.
There's a very sort of moving passage in the book where you talk about Saint-Lô, right? So where Beckett goes to after the war to work with the Irish Red Cross, and the beautiful book by Phyllis Gaffney, from a colleague from UCD, who Healing with the Runes, it talks about that Irish Red Cross hospital. And I was wondering about, what parts of Beckett's life would you talk about the resistance work in Paris, the network, again, or the time that he spends in Roussillon, and that there are references to that. But was the decision to spend more time describing Beckett's time in Saint-Lô deliberate, because what he saw there was first-hand the evidence of the sheer scale of the destruction that had been caused by the Saint-Lô.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it has been very heartbreaking to me, because I couldn't really talk about the war, because the book is written as a first person. Beckett is talking, the Beckett character, he's talking, and so I couldn't speak really about the war, because it would have need to give too much information to the reader. It would have changed the voice that I chose. So I decided to end the first part and go straight after the war. And the war was such an important time, because he had to change the way he dealt with life. He was a man very close upon himself, and very inhibited, very distant, and he really had to help people during the war. He had this very important resistance part of his life. He translated for the English, and there was this awful story about this priest who gave them, and this priest who was from Luxembourg, who spoke German, and went to the Nazis at the very beginning of the war and said, I want a wage, I want to have a salary every month, and I'll give you everybody you want, and I want a bonus for everyone, I'll give you more, So it was a horrible story, and this man was preaching, and he was preaching very anti-Nazi, because he knew he was protected. And this man entered in the group of resistance where Beckett was, and he gave the group. And this is Robert, he was called Robert Alech, and this is the most awful story. And Beckett had the time to run away, and he ran away with Suzanne, and it was a very, very difficult time for him. And after that, because his friends were killed and deported in he had to live with that. And after the war, when he went back to Ireland, he couldn't go back to France because everybody was checked, and what was this Irish man from a neutral country who wanted to go back to France, so he had to go with the Red Cross. It wasn't his choice, you know. And so the mission was to rebuild a hospital in Saint-Lô, and Saint-Lô is called Capitale des Ruines in France. It's 95% destructed during the war, after D-Day and all, and it was a nightmare. The whole city was a nightmare after the war. And he arrived there with the Red Cross and decided to rebuild the hospital of the mission. And he met all these strange characters. I mean, death was everywhere, and they got drunk every evening with the doctors, and you know, and go to see prostitutes. And it was a kind of Eros and Thanatos, you know, period of his life. But after that, after all he saw during the war, and after all his work came out as if it was the great experience he needed, because before the war he was a kind of writer who wasn't writing. I mean, except the first book, Murphy, he wasn't writing. There was huge inhibitions he couldn't get over. And then the war arrived, and much more important things arrived, that he had to do the job, you know, after the war. And it was also a tribute to all the horrors he has seen. So he was a man from that generation, and this is also very much forgotten, I think.
And one of the, when I was in the introduction, I said that you have worked for France Culture as a radio producer, a very good and effective producer, because you persuaded me to lie on the Strand and Sandymount because there was too much noise from the road, and the wind was blowing, so you had to lie behind the rocks in order to break the sound. So I was reading Ulysses with my face in the sand, but anyway, made for good radio. But I just wanted to just take up that point for a moment. Is the fact of your experience of working in radio and what you're working with, your material, or voices and sounds, I mean, is there a kind of a radiophonic aspect to the book itself that you want to read to hear these voices, to almost hear the sounds that make up Beckett's world?
Oh, for sure. Oh, that's very. Maybe. Well, I don't know what happened. Okay, I try this from far. Yes, the voice is very important in my work. I mean, I write by the voice, by the ear. I mean, I think it's very common things, but I had a lot of voices in my head, which is, I think, a normal thing for a writer. I don't know, but from all the people I interviewed, I can, you know, sometimes I remember sentences that people said to me in interviews, like if it was a song. You know, there's some sentences that stayed in my mind like a song, and this is I don't know. There's something musical, as everybody knows, about writing, and Beckett's. I heard Beckett before I read Beckett, and I saw Endgames when I was 15, and I heard those voices, you know, and those voices were not really talking to each other. And this is very strong memory, and that's why I thought, oh, when people talk to him, like the nurse asking something, or the physio asking, or the doctors asking, Beckett never answers in a direct way. You know, there's no dialogue. He answers to the reader, so he answers inside his head. To me, it was very important to have these people talking as they were belonging to different worlds. This was very strong memory. And yeah, the voice, and I could imagine this voice in a very, I've heard this very, it's maybe 1.5 minute interview of Beckett after a play, and I don't know if you've heard his voice in English, did you?
Yeah.
It's quite a nervous voice, speedy voice.
Yeah, I mean, he sounds to me like some of the people that taught me in Trinity when I was an undergraduate, that particular kind of accent that he had was in fact, I was surprised at how unaltered it was, by all these years in Paris and France. But it's very, very distinctive, very particular kind of voice. Maybe before we open the conversation to the floor, I just wanted to, I suppose my final question really was, so you looked up the Beckett book. Your most recent book is Yeats and Montcalm,
And the coffin.
And the coffin, indeed.
Which is the main character.
Because, and of course we've, in Ireland, a very, very long tradition, not so much of moving statues as moving graves of people. And this extends to statues that get, I think Queen Victoria was buried and dug up in Cork about 3 times before they finally decided what to do with her. So you're never in a safe place underground in Ireland. But one of there's a particular scene in the book where you have Joyce, so he's or Beckett is helping Joyce with his work in progress. And the sentence is, I type his English full of Ireland. Is there a sense in which, looking kind of subject matter of the 2 books to date, that you're writing a French that's full of Ireland? And to what extent, when you're doing that, is there a tension between, showing and telling? Between just presenting things to people and how much do you have to explain or contextualize things for your French readers?
I don't know. I think I needed to give few informations, but not too much. It's just the way maybe he felt, or I thought he felt, or there's strong connections with Joyce. He has really, really strange relationship with Joyce, and Joyce with him, and there's a whole irony about the master, and at the same time the huge respect for the writing of the master. So there's this kind of ambiguous relationships, and but there's the words at the end, because what matters is not what he experienced, what he lived with him, and the important thing is Ulysses, is Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and that's what's left, and that's what I think. It's strange that Beckett has written so much letters. And it seems that most of his friendship were by letters. He didn't like to see too much people or to speak, but he liked to write to people. And he always answered to the letters, and so the words are all what's left from him, and that's what was important, I guess. So it was a lovely company. I have to say that it seems to be very sad what I tell since the beginning, but Beckett was a lovely company. It was a way to see illness and even death in a very happy way. So I found a lot of happiness in his company as a reader, as a writer, and this was the important thing to me, And especially there's this beautiful poem of Beckett, which is called Lettre à AD, Letter to AD, you guys know? It's one of the doctors he met with the Red Cross when he was in Saint-Lô. And this guy is such a strange character, such a strange fellow. He was a doctor, and he was very, very focused on the patient and all that, and he got so drunk every evening and went to the brothel and got so crazy and, playing the violin. And this man is so extreme, 2 faces in the same man. And Beckett wrote this beautiful poem to AD, and this was very much the extreme life he had, and it was such secret man, and nobody knows. Well, people who get interested in Beckett would know, but the biography is not the first thing that would be said about the man. But he had a wonderful life, I thought.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying is a very, very useful corrective to sometimes a particular perception of Beckett as this kind of spectral, slightly gothic or terrifying voice or presence, and I think that the way in which you talk about and present him is it's a very useful kind of counterpoint or counter voice. We have time for, before we move to the reading of some extracts and reading of the translation of the extracts. Have anybody any questions or comments? Oh yeah. Microphones. Great. So, Cindy?
I don't think it works. It's loud, hopefully loud enough. Thank you so much. It was really great to hear you in conversation. I wonder about the translation process, because you started discussing like how Beckett himself translated, but I suppose like it was painful for him to self-translate, and it's different to get someone else to translate your own work. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the translation process, how did you collaborate, and maybe a word about the title as well, because I'm quite intrigued. Thank you. Okay. Just one. Stop working anymore. Yeah. Okay.
Whoa. Yeah. I was just thinking about the fact that he translated himself, Beckett. And when you read the two languages, he has found new things in English when he translated himself. So there's kind of two different works. I mean, that's not only translation, that's a new work on itself.
I think that we had a process whereby I translated the book and then my niece read it. And she validated what I had done. But we also had a really interesting experience afterwards, because my niece has turned the book into both a stage play and a radio play. And for the adaptation, my niece came to my house and we sat side by side and we read the translation. She read the French and I read the translation, and we went back and forth, moving between the languages and between the. She had, pared the book back to certain scenes, and that was a really wonderful experience, because as my niece has said, it's very much a book about the voice, and here it was just the voice and the voices, and we had an awful lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, we did. I was very lucky, to have this closeness and to find, even a way to translate jokes, because it's not always easy. And it was nice to work side by side, and
Literally.
Yeah, so we changed a bit of the translation of the novel at the same time, and it was nice.
Yeah,
a great experience. And there's another Irish story that I would like to tell. When the book has been out, and just after a few weeks, and happily got the prize by chance, and I texted Anthony from Linguistic Press that I met before, and had no answer for a year. And a year later, I got a text from Anthony saying, "Oh, right, I'm sorry, I'm very rude. I just had your texts. I don't open my WhatsApp very often. I'd love to publish the book." And I was like, how Irish is that story, Never happened anywhere else, So, and then we did that in a very short time, and I really enjoyed that,
Probably just as well that Becca wrote letters rather than sending emails or WhatsApps. Any other? Yes.
You have mentioned, first of all, thank you all so much for this evening. But you have mentioned the Irish humor, yeah. So I was just wondering if you tried to recreate it in any way, or if you think it is possible for someone, you know, to really do that if you are not Irish?
Yes, it's quite politically incorrect sometimes. But when I was writing the book, I did a few trips to Ireland, and I remember once a friend of mine said, told me that story that he was in the park in Marion Square, and that there was an old man and who saw a friend coming, and he said, "Oh, you're here! I was reading the newspaper to see if I could see you at the back of the newspaper." And I was like, okay, this is more Irish than ever. And yeah, this like the French people can enjoy that. It's not as trendy as it was, but yeah, I think we have that too.
Yes, I do remember a French friend, the first time she came to Dublin, and she was with her children, young children, in Marion Square, in the playground there, and there was a mother running after a child saying, "I'll murder you, I'll kill you, wait till I get home, I'll kill you." And she thought, maybe I should ring, the child support services. She was very alarmed at this, what seemed to be happening. Any other question from the...
And why later he would write beautiful novels, this kid.
Yes. But, okay, I think what we'll do now is we'll move to, I think you've agreed to read one or two. Yeah.
We need a second one.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully it will work.
It's not working. No.
Ça marche pas? Ce matin, un individu non identifié s'est introduit dans ma chambre. L'acolyte du type qui m'apprend d'habitude à tenir sur mes pattes. Il paraît que c'était prévu. Bon. À peine entré dans mon gourbi, le voici qui m'annonce la couleur. Monsieur Beckett, nous allons faire un petit test d'équilibre. Il crut bon de me rassurer en ajoutant: ne vous inquiétez pas, c'est facile, il suffit de faire ce que je vous dis.
This morning, an unidentified individual entered my room. An acolyte of the type that usually teaches me to stand upright on my own 2 feet. Apparently, it had all been arranged. Well, he had barely set foot in my den when he started laying down the law. "Mr. Beckett, we're going to test your balance," he added in order to reassure me. "Don't worry, it's easy. All you have to do is follow my instructions."
Première tuile, où il se trouve que depuis mon enfance, chaque fois qu'on me demande de faire quelque chose d'une certaine manière, j'ai l'impression de m'y employer sur le champ, de respecter scrupuleusement la consigne, alors qu'en réalité, il n'en est rien. Il se peut même que par un hasard extraordinaire, je me mette à faire, sans même m'en rendre compte, l'exact inverse de ce qui m'a été demandé. Ce qui, je le comprends, peut donner le sentiment que je me fous du monde. La plupart du temps, il n'en est rien. J'essaie de bien faire, mais les gestes n'obéissent pas. Ils contrarient la bonne foi qui est la mienne, me plongent dans des courants contraires et me laissent échouer dans un océan de contradictions. J'en ai souvent fait les frais dans mon enfance. Les oreilles m'en chauffent encore. J'en ai souvent fait les frais. Je n'y suis pour rien. Une sorte d'emmerdeur. A pain in the neck, comme on disait chez moi. Une écharde mal placée, très mal placée. Je suis le premier à le déplorer, sans pouvoir y faire grand-chose. Aussi, conscient de ce défaut congénital, n'abordai-je pas le fameux test avec le même enthousiasme débordant que mon interlocuteur, enthousiasme que je reliais chez lui à une ignorance crasse des épreuves que nous réserve l'existence, qui nous laisse pourtant peu le loisir de nous enthousiasmer outre mesure. Passons.
First hurdle. Since childhood, when anyone employs a certain tone of voice to ask me to do something, I think that I am instantly obeying orders, whereas in actual fact quite the opposite happens. It may even happen that entirely accidentally, I start to do the opposite without even being aware of what's going on. Now, I know that means people think I'm pulling their leg. Most of the time it couldn't be further from the truth. I try to do my best. My limbs won't obey me. They undermine my good faith. They plunge me into contradictory currents and leave me adrift in an ocean of contradictions. As a child, I often paid the price for such behaviour. My ears are still burning because of it. I often paid the price for it. It's not my fault. I was a kind of nuisance. A pain in the neck, as I was called at home. I was an awkwardly placed child. Very awkward. I'm the first to admit it, without being able to do anything about it. So, because I was aware of this congenital defect, I didn't approach the famous test with the same boundless enthusiasm as my interlocutor. An enthusiasm that I linked on his part to his absolute ignorance of the dangers life holds in store for us, that allow little room for us to be overly enthusiastic. In any case.
L'enthousiaste était fort imposant, chevelu comme un yéti, poil dégueulant de la blouse à pression. De son larynx sortait une voix tonitruante qui articulait une langue dont je n'étais pas certain de saisir les nuances. Il prit le soin de sortir un grand carnet, au bout duquel pendait un stylo rouge transparent à mine rétractable, avant de prononcer la phrase énigmatique suivante. « Allez, monsieur Beckett, test d'équilibre, échelle de Berg. » Il crut bon de compléter par la formule que voici. « C'est parti, mon kiki. »
The enthusiast was very well built, hairy as a yeti, with chest hair overflowing from his press-button tunic. A booming voice emerged from his larynx, using nuances of language which I was not sure I quite understood. He made a point of taking out a big notebook from which hung a transparent, retractable, red ballpoint pen, before pronouncing the following enigmatic sentence. Off you go, Mr. Beckett. This is a test of your balance, based on the Berg balance scale. He felt it necessary to complete the sentence with the following turn of phrase. Let's get the show on the road, Joe.
N'ayant pas encore obtenu d'explications précises, ni sur le kiki évoqué, ni sur les tenants et aboutissants exacts de la manœuvre qu'il me serait demandé d'accomplir, je décidai dans un premier temps de passer sur la familiarité de l'ours. Peut-être était-ce lui le kiki en question, je commençais à le penser, considérant qu'il y avait somme toute une certaine cohérence entre l'esprit de la bête et son allure. Nous n'en étions encore qu'au début des présentations, lorsque l'animal revint à la charge, me suggérant tout un tas d'acrobaties auxquelles je me soumis avec la foi inébranlable d'un enfant de paroisse. « Monsieur Beckett, veuillez vous lever en essayant de ne pas vous aider avec vos mains, s'il vous plaît. » Je fis un essai, avant de me rattraper de justesse. Nouvelle tentative, nouvel échec, pas mieux. Attendez, je coche, peut se lever seul, mais avec l'aide de ses mains. On continue, c'est reparti. Dieu nous préserva d'une autre rime.
Since he had given me no precise instructions as to the movements he wanted me to perform, and had failed to identify the Joe in question, I decided not to take issue with the overfamiliar form of address that the Yeti had employed. Was he himself the Joe in question? That was what I had begun to believe. Thinking that there was, all things considered, a form of coherence between the body and the mind of the creature. We had scarcely got started with the exercises when the beast went at it again, suggesting a whole range of physical jerks which I undertook with the good faith of a holy communicant. Mr. Beckett, please stand up without using your hands. I gave it a go. I just about caught myself in time, tried again, failed again, no better. Wait a second, I'm ticking the box for can't stand up unaided, aided by his hands. Off we go again, get the show on the road. God save us from another rhyme.
So you can see just how effective the translation is, and just hearing the two voices there was fascinating, that kind of stereophonic encounter between author and translator. And at the risk, of course, of quoting the physio from the book, I'm very glad we got this show on the road this evening, because I think on behalf of everyone here, thank you, Maylis, for a very generous response to the questions and taking part in the conversation. And Clíona, we're very grateful to you for bringing the gift of translation and this text in English for people who don't have access to the French text, and showing the kind of the creativity of that process and moving from one language to the other. And it was Oliver Conan who wrote an essay on translated verse in the 17th century, an Irishman, and he said that the best kinds of translation are forms of friendship, and I think you certainly get a sense of that, of the way in which this happened this evening. So many thanks to the Service Culturel, to the Alliance Française, and to Lilliput Press, and to Anthony Farrell, Dana, everybody who made this possible this evening, and most of all, the relief post-COVID of seeing full houses. And again, I can't tell you how important it is. And so many thanks for coming here this evening. So, comments.
Maylis will now be glad to sign her 26th translation of this extraordinary work.